Hello, Bob. Let's jump right into it. Could you share a specific project where data helped you solve the problem, and what was the main goal you are trying to achieve?
Yeah. So I just wrote, for example, I just wrote a book, and the book is about basically understanding what causes people to say today's the day they're going to leave this company and go to that company. And so
Hmm.
part of it is framing the problem in the right way, which is most people only focus on, for example, what do you want in your next job? But ultimately, we have to actually see the string or the thread that goes from basically why are they leaving and where are they going. And so part of it was being able to actually build an interview protocol to basically get the causation of what causes people to say today's the day I'm going to leave, because they're connected, both are connected. And so you need to know what we call the pushes and the pulls. And so ultimately it's qualitative data. And what I learned very early in my life is that we can create variables. And so ultimately I was able to look at and be able to do interviews in a way to parameterize kind of these underlying causes. And so what you start to realize is we end up getting to a series of, if you will, 14 different kinds of variables that are like, if I look at all the stories, I can see that there are 14 variables on the push side that push people to leave. And then ultimately I found 16 variables on the pull side that of
Hmm.
what people were looking for. And so ultimately it was about connecting those two sides. One of the things that I realized though is that they're not symmetrical. Most people assume if like, hey, I want it to be faster, or it's too slow, the push is always too slow. We assume the answer is, oh, they want it faster. But the reality
Hmm.
is sometimes they'll say it's too slow and ultimately they want to do more. And doing more is
Hmm.
very different than going faster. And so you start to realize that all of a sudden it's this asymmetrical pieces of the data that you start to play with. And so ultimately it was about being able to walk into a situation where I knew nothing, be able to figure out what are the variables that are involved in the situation, starting to define cause and effect, and then ultimately being able to connect the pushes and the pulls together to basically understand kind of what's the thread through each of these stories.
And what goal you are trying to achieve by doing so?
What I'm trying to achieve is ultimately understanding kind of the reasons and the causes of why people leave and where do they want to go so they actually can choose better. So ultimately most people, like, the number one phrase that people would say is like, oh, I got so lucky finding my job, like my next job. And the reality is like, you know, I believe luck is about timing, but luck is not. Luck is where opportunity, or basically opportunity and preparedness hit each other. And so ultimately I was trying to get to what were people prepared to go do, and what is the level of energy that needs to be there to basically make people actually make the change. So you start to realize there's a lot of people say, who would want a new job? You get a lot of people to raise their hand, but the reality is how many people are willing to actually make the change. That's a different story. And so you start to realize I want to be able to understand the threshold by which people are actually kind of making that change.
Okay. So walk us through the key steps you took to solve this problem using data. Like,
Yeah,
what's your
so
approach?
so yeah, so the first thing is to do the qualitative interviews, and we do the qualitative interviews in a form where we use something called the timeline and the forces, and ultimately we're able to understand kind of the sequence of things that had to happen to people to make them ready to leave, and then ultimately the choice of basically what to do next is all in the head. It's all basically what I call fantasy, or it's this notion of what you think you want. And so ultimately it's about being able to actually distinguish between the reality of now and the fantasy of tomorrow, because we can't predict tomorrow. And so it's that aspect of one parameterizing those features or those parameters or those, variables. Ultimately, once we define the variables, we then go back to each story and code each story to basically, is it part of that story or not? And so we basically have I've done many different kind of weighting methods, but ultimately it's come back to be a very simple method of, is this variable part of their story or not? 0 if it's not, a 1 if it is. And then we end up with an eigenvector that's about 30 variables long. And then what we do is we end up doing a cluster analysis, and finding the algorithm to do clusters was always very difficult, because at some point these are very asymmetrical things, and you start to realize that it's finding a centroid or finding basically an average of it. It's more about actually talking about next nearest neighbor. So it's like, what two stories are most alike? And ultimately, how different are the stories? And ultimately, you start to realize, like, when the stories become very different, they have a very big distance between those eigenvectors. And so you're able to
Mhm.
actually then see kind of like how many different stories you have. Do you have 2 stories? Do you have 5 stories? Do you have 8 stories? How many stories do you have? And so we end up doing a lot of interviews in this case, but ultimately we were able to kind of distinguish that there were four patterns of how people basically make their change in their job.
And what happened next?
And so ultimately from that, we were able to understand that causation. And then from there, we built a process to actually then facilitate people through this notion of how many people want to change their jobs. And ultimately now we have a coaching process that out of that we're able to basically help people through it. And once we built that coaching process, we were able to write a book about it.
And while working on this project, like what were the biggest obstacles you face? Some kind of issues with data availability, maybe some technical challenges or other challenges you had to
I
face?
think one of the biggest obstacles usually is the fact of conventional knowledge. Like, so what happened is I did this with two other people. And so what happens is they have this conventional knowledge about, for example, the reason why people leave is money. And what we found out is it's not, money is actually a very abstract concept in in these interviews, because you realize like they want more money for basically because they have to provide for their family, or they need more money because they want respect, or they want more money because they feel like that's what progress feels like. And so you start to realize that sometimes it's a metric, sometimes it's an emotion, sometimes it's actually very functional. And you start to realize like the aspect of being able to kind of disregard what I would say is the conventional average knowledge, and being able to make it very specific to contextual variables.
And let's talk about a little bit about your book. Like, let's assume like someone will read your book. Like, what is the main thing they can receive from
Yeah.
reading your book?
So what this is there's a couple of things that you can do with it. One is when when you get to the point where you're like, you know what, it's time for me to go, it allows you to one, start to actually describe your context. And so most people aren't aware of their context. And so this is making the implicit explicit, and being able to understand, are you really ready? And it ultimately, is this enough energy for you to figure out what to do next? Because finding a new job is actually hard work. And most people are like, it's like, it's just so much work. But ultimately, you have to actually muster the energy to figure out how to actually do this. And so it's about actually, one, helping you actually see the situation you're in. Two is then the process starts to then articulate, what are you good at and what do you suck at? And so it's this notion of being able to help you build an inventory around yourself about your skills and your abilities. So it's really about abilities and capabilities, not what you did. Most resumes are about what you did, not what you do. And so now we have a way of talking about what you do. And once you have the notion of what you can do, you start to actually have more agency. So most people, if they've been a marketing person or they've been an engineer, they kind of like, oh, I have to be I'll go find another job as a marketer. But the reality is, if you like to write, you could become a writer. You could become, there's a lot more agency to do many different things. And so that aspect then helps them kind of realize that there's more possibilities. And then we start to focus on what they want. Like, what are the things you want, and getting down to the trade-offs. There's no such thing as a perfect job. And so what we end up doing is what we end up trying to frame it for people to basically say, like, you can actually make more money, but now you have to go into the office, which makes you commute. Are you willing to do that? Or would you rather actually make less money and actually be remote and do it this way, and you get to make the choice? And so it's about framing the notion of kind of what are your options and what are your alternatives and what are the trade-offs you have to make. And so we
And
learned all that from these interviews, and then extracting the causation out of it, and then enabling other people. Like, so think of it as we by studying the people who basically did it, we're able to then help the people behind them who haven't done it yet to actually facilitate that change.
what would you do differently if you were to start this project again, like having this knowledge about
So the
mental
thing
health?
is yeah. So the thing is that I'm a big proponent of very small sample sizes, because I believe that causation can be seen in 10 or 15 interviews. We end
Hmm.
up doing a lot of interviews because of we have some academic rigor we had to do. The other part is what I say is it took us almost 15 years to kind of basically gather all this data. But the reality is we could have basically had the answer way sooner. But the notion is we wanted to be rigorous around it. But the
Hmm.
fact is that I believe we could have found these answers with a lot less data than when we had. But ultimately, the
Hmm.
fact is if it's going to be kind of public, you have to actually do that rigor. And so when I do this kind of analysis for myself, I usually only do 10 to 12, and I can build a product off of 10 to 12 interviews. In this case, we did over 1,000 interviews over a 15-year period.
Awesome. Awesome. And what specific tools or platforms were essential in helping you gather, process, and
So
analyze the data for this
yeah, yeah.
project?
Ryan Singer and I have built some very custom software for us, and so part of it is basically being able to a way in which to build the variable sets, right? And so part of this is a custom piece of software, but then what we used is basically Python and then different clustering methods to be able to basically pull that apart. And so ultimately, it was just Python that was the main variable or the main software that we end up using to basically help us build out kind of the cluster.
And how did you ensure data quality through the process?
So what we end up doing from a data quality perspective, there's three checks. One check is basically when we actually code the data. So because we're coding the data, we're not actually asking users to code the data, we're coding the data. So the first part is that what we're doing is we're actually doing this as a group. And so there's at least
Mm-hmm.
three to five and very different people in the room to basically make sure that we understand as we're coding the data that this was part of their story or not. And then two is that we have actually data checks where we actually go back and then look at the so as the cluster puts the interviews together, we then review those interviews together to basically say, do these stories really belong together or do we need to move it? And so we have a quality check afterwards. And then the third was basically being able to make sure that as we laid this out, we actually had the right verbatims that actually tied to it. And we had basically transcripts tied to each of the interviews that then we could pull.
Looking at the bigger picture, what emerging technologies or trends you are seeing on the horizon in the next 1 or 2 years, which could be impactful for you in the terms of new technology? You are excited about something, or you are even
Yeah.
starting to using something right now?
Yeah. So what I would say is I think ChatGPT or large language models are getting better and better. But like for example, there's still that they can't. It's still based on word definition and probability of using a word as opposed to definition of the word. And so you start to
Hmm.
realize like the word money would come out a lot because people talked about money. But the fact is ultimately it's not about money. It's about respect or it's about these other things. And so you start to realize that there's some limits to the current set of data. So the other
Hmm.
part is to actually understand, and what I'm working on right now is basically voice, basically being able to understand the intonation of how people speak. Because, like for example, boy, that was really good versus boy, that was really good. Same transcript, same set of words, but very very different meaning. And so part of it is
Hmm.
being able to get down to the subtleties of how people say the words. Because at some point, again, me being so I'm dyslexic, and so I actually read more into how people say the phrase as opposed to what they say.
And on practical level, like how are you using AI in your day-to-day work? Like,
Yeah.
do you have specific prompts or approaches which are helpful for you?
Yeah, so I'm using it mostly right now, not in a gathering sense, because it doesn't like I've been, how do I say, I've been testing to see if it can actually gather the insights as I find the insights, and it cannot do that. But what I have been doing is using it to help me summarize, and as I pull these interviews and put the interviews together, it can actually find, basically similarities and differences between things very, very well. And so I use it in a post-analysis process, but not necessarily in a gathering perspective or basically in an analysis process because it doesn't have the subtleties yet to be able to figure that out.
And finally, based on your experience, what advice would you give someone looking to leveraging data more efficiently in their business?
The thing to me is ultimately is to be able to actually get down to, so I call it, there's like three layers of language that people use. There's a pablum layer, which is this layer of what people just say, like, oh, how was your day? Oh, it was good. Okay. But ultimately the fact is what made it good. And so there's the second layer where you basically get to what I call fantasy nightmare, where they exaggerate. And so the reality is what we need to do is get down to the causal layer, which is the actual what happened to you or what are you expecting to happen. And so ultimately, it's ultimately looking for cause and effect and not correlation. So correlation is not causation. And so we have to actually strive to basically get causation into our data models.
And if someone would like to read your book, where they can
Yeah,
find it?
it's called Job Moves, and it's hold on a second, it's right here. So it's
Hmm.
Job Moves, the 9 steps basically for
Awesome.
making progress in your career. And ultimately, the fact is that you can find it on Amazon or any bookstore should basically have it. We were published by HarperCollins, so it's in bookstores as well.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for being a part of the DDDM, DDDM podcast, and answering all
Thanks
my
for having
questions
me,
today.
Lucas. Thanks.
And cut. Okay, so I'll just stop the record.